Welcome to another screencast. This is a screencast for air masses, also known as the best time ever. So, just going to walk you through this. This is in Google Slides. So, we're looking at letter designations and what they stand for and the characteristics in order to understand air masses better. I'll show you a really cool transition. The page flipped. How exciting. So, C stands for continental. And an air mass that forms over a continental area, land, would be dry. Maritime is air that forms over water, so it's wet. Arctic, the characteristic of an Arctic air mass would be that it forms close to the poles, so it's bitterly cold. Polar forms at high latitudes and is cold. It's kind of weird that a polar air mass doesn't form near the poles. That would probably make more sense, but just know that an Arctic air mass is bitterly cold and a polar air mass is classified as cold. And then tropical, which makes total and complete sense, it forms in tropical regions and is warm. So these are the letter designations, what they stand for, and now we're going to combine the letters to summarize air masses in general. So if I have a continental Arctic air mass, since it's Arctic, it's going to be bitterly cold, and my moisture content is going to be dry since it formed over a continent. Continental polar air mass would be cold, and it would be dry because it formed over land. Continental tropical, so tropical, warm, forming over land or continent, would be dry. Maritime polar, a polar air mass would be cold, and the moisture content would be wet since it formed over water or as a maritime air mass. Maritime tropical air mass would be warm and wet. So now you have the characteristics of the various air masses, what the letters stand for. And by the way, it's not a misprint or spelling error, but it's lowercase c, capital A, lowercase c, capital P. So the first letter is always lowercase, that's the convention, and the second letter is always capitalized when we get to air masses. If you look at page 13 in the Earth Science Reference Table, that's a large picture of it, zoomed out, and we're going to look at just the air masses. They're there for you on page 13, so you don't have to memorize what the letter abbreviations are and what they stand for, but you do have to know what the characteristics are. We look at the United States, and I put this map in because I like colors. It's kind of cool looking. We're going to see where the source regions are for the various air masses. So a little bit more useful is to see the oceans around it so that you could better determine where the source regions would be for each particular air mass. So a continental tropical air mass, continental forms over continents or land, tropical warm. Mexico would be a source for a continental tropical air mass for the United States, as well as Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, parts of Texas could be considered a continental tropical air mass. The Gulf of Mexico is probably the most common source region for a maritime tropical air mass, especially for us in New York. It could also be in the South Pacific Ocean as well. We could have influence of a maritime tropical air mass, because remember, the southwesterly winds move the winds from the east coast or from the southeast, right? So what's happening over here? So we have southwesterly winds, I apologize, we name winds where they're coming from, and they're going to blow to the northeast of the United States. So they're coming from the southwest and blowing to the northeast of the United States. Continental polar comes from Canada, A. Maritime polar comes from the northern Pacific. It could also come from the northern Atlantic at times when the winds shift. So those are the air masses and the source regions from them. Probably noticed that poor little continental Arctic air mass is not noted here at all. That's because we have to go really far north to see. So these are the ones that we already talked about, and then there would be the continental Arctic air mass that are really, really close to the poles or really very, very high latitude. That's where the continental Arctic air masses would form. You do not have maritime Arctic air masses because an Arctic air mass is so cold it really can't hold any moisture at all. This is just a graphic that you'll see in textbooks, support materials, review books, or if you go to see a musical about air masses, they might use this as one of their graphics. And then, of course, figured you might want to see this. With this really cool, groovy United States through a kaleidoscope where the air masses would be, and notice that continental Arctic isn't there because it doesn't go far enough north. Which leads us to this point. I guess if your horn doesn't work, maybe that's what he was doing. I'm hoping that's what he was doing. I'm hoping he wasn't practicing his trumpet while he was driving. That would probably be pretty dangerous, but interesting nonetheless. So hopefully this screencast clarified some information about air masses. Just remember that the longer an air mass is over that area, the more that air mass will be like those characteristics. So if I have, I'll go a little bit back in time over here, if I have an air mass that's a continental polar air mass that's stagnating or staying in this area for a number of days or even a week or two, it will be more continental polar than if it's just there for a day or so. So a way to think of it is, imagine we took this continental polar air mass and we stuck it over here in the Gulf of Mexico for 1 second. Is that really going to change the characteristics of that air mass? No, it probably will still be cold and dry. But if we took that continental polar air mass, had a really big Ziploc bag, and brought it over here to the Gulf of Mexico and let it stay there for a week, it's going to develop into a maritime tropical air mass. So the longer an air mass stagnates, is the word that they oftentimes use, the more it will be like that particular area. So hopefully you enjoyed this screencast, and hopefully you enjoyed that, because I certainly did.